Awesome. Hey everyone, I'm Ayodele Odubela. I'm a data scientist at SambaSafety. Right now I'm working on trying to understand driver risk and hopefully make drivers a little bit better and make the roads a little safer. So I'm excited to talk about building really diverse teams. And the first thing I want to really go over when we start talking about diversity is that it's not just white women. So there are so many different aspects to diversity, and we tend to see a lot of these efforts that help white women most. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but even when we're talking about the history and even very recently, looking at things like women's rights and women gaining the right to vote, not all women are given the right, we're given the right to vote at the same time. White women earned that vote before Black women, before Latinx women, before Indigenous women. So there are a lot of aspects of nuance when we're talking about diversity that we don't really go over, but it's really important when we're thinking about how we build our teams and how we create spaces that are truly inclusive. So here are just a couple different kinds of diversity. I think we should start thinking about this on a broader term too. So not just looking at gender and race, but also disability status, understanding if people have non-traditional backgrounds. If we're talking about machine learning and AI, that is a absolutely valid area of someone having a diverse opinion and bringing a unique perspective with them to their work. And going along with that is immigrant and veteran status. So thinking about these diverse groups.
Hi, how are you, Shipra?
I'm doing well, how are you?
I'm good. I am like jumping from meeting to meeting.
Sorry, Ayodele, could you unmute yourself? We had to just mute everyone.
Sorry about that. So no worries. Looking at the other types of diversity that are important here too are really this immigrant and veteran status. So we need to just start thinking about this more broadly and covering not just groups that are protected classes, but also people who have been really historically marginalized, and understanding that they have diverse perspectives and unique things to bring to these data teams. So if you're looking to build a data team and trying to build one that is diverse, you kind of have to define what this diversity really means in your workplace. And that takes a level of understanding of the historical and social context, especially around technology in general. It's also important to note that groups of people are diverse and individuals aren't. So when we're talking about people, you're not hiring a diverse person, you're building a diverse team. You're just hiring a person who has most of these aspects of diversity are immutable things about them. So they're just characteristics. So I think it's important that we are intentional with our language around this. And thinking about this more from an inclusion perspective. So inclusion is a right and not just a privilege. I really like this quote because diversity kind of feels like it's over talked about and unfortunately has a bad connotation for people. It makes people think about quotas. But the fact that people exist and have certain characteristics about them, that just by being alive, this is a right to be included. And unfortunately, we've created a lot of spaces and systems that don't do that. So the first step really for any team is to measure where you stand. This is something I've recently done as part of my employee resource group at my role in my company now. But really understanding where are you currently, how does that match up to national demographics where you're headquartered, and are you measuring these statistics across your teams? So understanding leadership, understanding the difference between hourly and salary employees over all of these different kinds of demographics. And it's really important to set goals for where you should be. So creating realistic goals, based off of what would create equity? What would fix some of the issues that you systemically had at your company, and not just to say, we've matched the national average or the national ratio for this specific demographic, and that's all the work you have to do. So part of creating these goals is really assessing why your team isn't currently diverse. So you might be coming from the perspective of you're building a brand new team, or you have a small team and are trying to grow it. But it's really trying to understand why you don't have the diversity that you should. And I think for a lot of companies, it really just comes down to your networks, unfortunately. Especially in tech, we highly leverage who we know, and that can be a huge detriment for a lot of people. And typically these people all have non-traditional backgrounds. They don't have degrees from Stanford or MIT. However, if they can prove value and like have impact on their teams, it's important for us to really assess some of the qualities that we prefer when we're hiring new data people. And so it really comes down to understanding this pipeline. So knowing that there's a very small amount of Black or Latinx students who graduate with computer science or data science or statistics degrees, we have to understand a lot of people who are in data science and machine learning are coming from the domain side. So maybe they were an analyst in healthcare and have been able to upskill in statistics and coding to be in these more analytical technical roles. We have to create some of these goals for what we want our teams to ultimately look like, and then build the steps there essentially. So I want to cover performative diversity really briefly, because I think it's something that is easy and it can seem like you're trying to help, but really doesn't address the underlying issues. So the problem with a lot of companies is they say, you know, regardless of where we stand right now, let's measure our diversity and we want to show off what our diversity looks like. The problem with that is that we are really hearing, hey, we want people to see the diversity for our own needs, our own objectives, but we're not really doing the work to fix some of those systemic problems. And a solution that almost every company can take internally and externally is really saying, we want to subvert the status quo. We want to change what the status quo is that's made it difficult for us to hire underrepresented employees. That's the mindset you're going to have if you want to truly build diverse teams and also retain these employees and not have a really high churn rate and have really bad exit reviews about, you know, bringing people in as not even diversity hires, but having to do additional work on top of their technical work without that being acknowledged at all. So a couple of tactics you can take to really show this like anti-racist stance you want to take as a company is to create equity really with both how you're hiring and within your products in ways that you can. So creating realistic career paths for new employees. This is really important and especially important for underrepresented employees. There should be paths to leadership for those who are interested in leadership. And really having a formal way to address microaggressions and a formal way to address these bigoted topics that unfortunately come up in the workplace. And then having your employees trained on how to create equity, not only in how they're assessing other employees, but when they are doing, you know, 6-month reviews, when they're doing yearly reviews, really understanding how you can create equity with how you interact with your diverse employees or your underrepresented employees, and not just training people about unconscious bias training and making that a mandatory thing that people will see as the annoying kind of task they have to check off, the same way we feel with a lot of the like phishing campaigns and emails. And then the step that's really huge is to actually have severe punishments and having a zero tolerance policy for racism in the workplace. There are unfortunately so many incidents that do slide that I think reduce the whatever value that you could have brought to an employee or what they could have brought to you. It's not just going to impact their work, it's going to impact so many other things that we unfortunately have toxic employees that need to actually have consequences for their actions. And that's kind of just the face of it. And next step is really moving towards sponsorship and advocacy from senior leaders over mentorship. So looking at the statistics, unfortunately, mentorship doesn't work in the way we want it to. It doesn't work for necessarily building those diverse leaders and seeing drastic change in these diversity numbers. So we do have to move more towards having corporate sponsors who actually go out and advocate for you in a structured way that's both easy to document and later you can look back and understand these steps were taken with these candidates and these steps were taken with another group of candidates to understand if you're actually having issues with treating employees differently in the workplace. And I think this last bit here is really important. There's a lot of work that I do and there's a lot of work that so many of us do on top of our day jobs that is spent on anti-racism work that we're typically not compensated for or recognized for. So internally, having a formal way to give bonuses or incentivize or honestly having a separate hourly contract with your employees if they're going to be doing anti-racism work on behalf of your company that's outside of their day job. And like I mentioned earlier, really focusing on inclusion and equity over just having a diverse pool of people. So for a lot of organizations, it's hard to create a diverse team when they don't have diverse applicants. And in a minute, I'll go over a couple more ways to do that, but understanding that we want to create workplaces where underrepresented people want to be. They want to actually be there and contribute and stay there. So creating systems that make them feel included and creating systems that create equity within your pool of employees is really important. So a couple objectives for building some of these data teams. You'll see these come up a lot, but equality and equity are both really important. I separate them out because equality is really about making sure that candidates that have equal qualifications essentially have an equal chance to be interviewed. So there isn't discrimination based off of names, based off of gender, really leveling that playing field. And then equity is really ways that we can provide more resources to people who are historically marginalized and excluded from opportunities. So I think it's important that in our hiring processes, we think about, okay, we have, 4% Black women who have applied for roles. Maybe we connect them with either a Black woman at our company or someone at our company to have conversations pre-actual interview. We need to take more steps towards creating equity and not just thinking about ethics, but really pushing towards justice.
Hi, Ayodele. This is amazing. I just wanted to do a quick time check. We will be wrapping up in a minute so we can get to the next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry if I breezed through this last little bit, but going over quickly, our other internal objectives I think are important for data teams are to guide that product strategy in ways that avoid unequal outcomes. And also thinking about this in that we want to reduce these major AI incidents. So there are plenty of examples that have been covered just today, but creating teams that have an environment where these these underrepresented employees come in and they can also speak openly about these problems, and that's listened to and actually implemented instead of just kind of heard and the product goes on uninhibited as well. So going into the second half, rebuilding some of our HR strategies, we have a very small pool of Black PhD computer science grads. And that's not because of lack of interest, but we have to understand the historical context around this. One of the ways teams can improve this, though, and really try to get more Black applicants in is building relationships with HBCUs. Another step is really making sure they foster an anti-racist work environment, incentivize employees for reporting discrimination instead of really facing backlash for that. And understanding that monetary incentives, especially for white people, doesn't work as far as increasing diversity on your team. There's also ways to reach out to hiring sites that are catered towards marginalized groups. Here's just a few, but there are a lot more out there. And I think it's important that it's just about finding the right groups and spending more time to make sure we find people where they're at. You can also anonymize some steps in the hiring process as well.
Is it okay